thank you very much for having me, and good morning all. I think it's great that we can meet virtually. Obviously, I would also have loved to come to Portugal, but it's sunny here in Rotterdam right now. And this way, hopefully, it also provides a way to be very interactive and reach a bigger audience. What I want to share with you this morning, and it was also addressed in the plenary, is urban transitions and how we can understand the dynamics of urban transitions, but more importantly, what we can do to seize the momentum that we are in, and develop a form of urban governance that proactively embraces transitions so that we can move towards sustainable and just cities. And I'm very happy that it was underlined that it's not only about environmental, but it's also about social justice. And to me, both of them are clearly intertwined. So I will share a presentation and talk for maybe 18 more minutes now on the dynamics, but also the governance and agency of sustainability transitions. So very briefly on my institute, these are my colleagues. And I showed deliberately their faces. We are an institute of around 40 people, so there's a bit more included. But what we do is we do academic research in and with practice. So our approach is to do not only do academic research, but to really do transdisciplinary work in and with cities. So in my presentation, the second part, I will also show some of the projects that we're doing and some of the tools that are produced. We work a lot also with European cities. And later on in the expo, you can meet one of my colleagues, Georgia Silvestri, who will be able to share in more detail some of the approaches and tools that we introduce in cities to do transition governance. So what we do at Drift is in a very hybrid way combine academic research with education for practitioners and students and consulting. So we work a lot also with local government in the Netherlands, with businesses, with private actors that are at the forefront of these sustainability transitions, really asking the question, how can we create a more transformative change? And our collaborations always start to some extent with a frustration of actors, government actors, business actors, communities, a frustration that things are not moving quickly enough. And that's also the foundation behind or underneath the whole transitions research network. That's now a global network. It started 25 years ago in Western Europe, based on this assessment that we know for decades already that we have a sustainability problem. And we've developed all sorts of policies and mechanisms. So at the global UN level, and here you see the figures from IPCC, the climate panel, and IPBES, the biodiversity panel. I think most of you are aware of it. They started in the early 1990s, but also at the city level, we have the Covenant of Mayors, we have all sorts of sustainability policies. But if you look at the bigger picture, we are still on a pathway of unsustainability. Basically, we continue our development along a pathway that creates climate change and biodiversity loss. And even worse, at an urban level, and these are just some pictures from my own city, these persistent problems, as we refer to in transition research, are very tangible and visible. Think about the pollution, air quality, socio-economic differences. Pictures on the right are about health inequalities. So the interlinkage between air quality, lifestyles, quality of the houses, education level, income, and they actually show how intertwined ecological and social challenges and problems are. So the conclusion that transitions research starts from is that somehow with the current approaches, even sustainable development approaches, we are unable to achieve a transformative change. We are locked in what we call regimes, a dominant shared way of thinking, doing, and organizing. And a regime, it's we don't refer to a political regime. For us, a regime is a term we borrow from ecology and from complex system science. It's basically the way that we are used to how things are organized. So social scientists will talk about shared cultures. So what we think is normal, in many cases, it's normal to have a car to go to your work by a car, for example. Structures. So all the things that provide structure to a societal domain, like the mobility domain again, where we build roads, we create all sorts of rules and regulations around it and infrastructures, and our practices, how we behave. So we apply this concept to energy regimes, the food regime, the mobility regime, the education regime, but we can also think about the spatial regime. Porto is very different than Rotterdam, so we have a different culture, we have a different geography, we have a different spatial characteristics, different economic structures, and those regimes evolve over time. They're very stable, they provide stability to society, so we need regimes, but they also are the cause of what we call path dependency. It's basically what keeps us locked into a dominant system. And what we do, and this is the governance explanation behind the inertia of these regimes, is that we continuously try to use planning and management and innovation to improve these regimes, to basically make them less bad. So what do we do as planners or as governance actors, as rational actors? We try to identify problems, and we start to develop plans to come up with solutions and to implement these solutions. But especially in the planning context, more and more, it's about creating the idea that later on someone else will actually implement these solutions. In the meantime, a society or reality is happening. What also happens is that in this rational context of analyzing, identifying solutions, trying to implement solutions, a lot of the emphasis is put on control and reducing risks and trying to be certain about the impact and the contribution of an innovation. So we call it transition blindness, because within this regime context, you don't see the major disruptions coming. Like companies in the electricity sector that for one reason or another often didn't see the solar and wind revolution coming, while all the indicators pointed in that direction. What's also inherent to how we have organized our policy regimes is a focus on innovation. So we continuously try to add new things to the existing. So we have a problem, we look for alternatives, and they become add-ons to the existing regime. So rather than to remove things or stop doing things, we add. And the last thing, and that's really also something that became clear over the course of the last year, is a lack of belief or maybe even imagination that an alternative is really possible. It's also a human condition. We expect tomorrow to be more or less the same as today. So our understanding as human beings is more gradual and incremental rather than exponential. So these are a couple of also the agency explanations for inertia, and the scientific term is path dependency. A transition now is scientifically defined as a structural, non-linear change in such a regime. The structural is important, but also the non-linear. Because regimes, in a regime context, there's innovation, there's change going on all the time. But a transition is a non-linear regime change. So it comes with disruptions and tensions. There's a lot of historical examples. So there's by now a library full of historical case studies of transitions. A lot of them are also visible in the urban context. Think about the hygiene transitions or the technologically driven renewal in cities. building revolutions, but also think about the food revolution, or interesting technological transitions as the rise and fall of the compact disc. There's political transitions, but there's also failed transitions we can study. Like on the top, you see Jimmy Carter in 1979 in front of the White House and a field of solar panels, hailing in the start of the energy transition. 3 days later, Ronald Reagan came into office, and his first act was to get rid of the garbage in the front lawn. The main message here is that we see a lot of these historical transitions, and afterwards, so historians can reconstruct these transitions as a regime shift from A to B. Right now, we think we are in the midst of a decade of transformative change. But so far, there is, maybe except for electricity or maybe even mobility, not a lot of evidence about that we are actually in transitions, let alone that we are able to predict where these transitions will take us, what these future regimes will be. And now comes the interesting part, because that's up to us where these transitions will go. And to combine sort of the historical insight in how these historical transitions worked and the insights from complex systems thinking, and make that productive for the transitions that we want, that we are now in the middle of, we use this kind of simplified graph, the X-curve, we call it, and it basically captures the three combined forces that produce transformative, disruptive, nonlinear change. The most fundamental one is at the background of this figure, which is gradual societal change around us. Demographic changes, geopolitical changes, climate change, digitalization and technological innovation, they are the background against which transitions in our societal regimes take place. And then the transitions themselves are a combination of two forces. One, it starts on the top left, is basically that we all are part of these regimes and we try to improve it. But because of the lock-in and path dependency, it becomes more and more difficult to achieve the kind of innovation that is needed to adapt to a changing context, to become more sustainable. At a certain point, a fossil fuel car can never be zero emission. So you need to shift to a new technology. But at a certain point also, you don't get more public space by having more efficiency in your parking policy. You need to get rid of cars. So what is happening at the regime level is that it becomes harder and harder to improve. More and more people start to get frustrated. It destabilizes, leading to internal crises. And in the end, that will also lead to breakdown and phase out of old technologies, old practices, old cultures. What's also happening at the other hand, and that's the upward curve starting on the bottom left of your screen, is that very early on, people will start to innovate, to come up with alternatives. And over time, these alternatives become stronger, more competitive, less alternative, and they might become part of the norm. And the interesting thing is that in many cases, and we do a lot of transition mapping, and you can do it for yourself, for your own topic, in your own city, what kind of dynamics do you see? It's often a combination of increasing pressures on regimes. People start to delegitimize the way things are going, and the emergence of alternative competition. And then we have the perfect storm, you might say, because it's about entering a period of very uncertain and also unmanageable change. So we then talk about the transition momentum. These are some pictures from last year in the Netherlands. We see a lot of societal tensions between groups that want a more rapid change. So the climate movement, for example, they are, or the Black Lives Matter here, pushing for radical institutional change. And more policymakers and people in businesses also embrace this narrative. And I think all the scientific evidence is there that we actually need it. But at the other hand, and here are the farmers in the Netherlands, there are a lot of groups in society that fear these kind of changes because it creates uncertainty about jobs, about employment, about future economic prospects. And then on top of it, we have this COVID crisis. Um, and that is an amplifier of this destabilization. So, what we scientifically see now is that the regimes that we have built up, the way that we've organized our economy, our mobility, our energy systems, is destabilizing. It cannot be sustained much longer. More and more people start to discuss it, delegitimize it, and undermine it by moving in an alternative direction. So this is a hopeful news, actually, because this non-linear change is visible in renewables, in food, in mobility, in even in the finance system. People are shifting to alternative models, and this is a promising movement. What we also look at, because these are some technological examples, is the growth of what we call transformative social innovation. So all sorts of practices that are visible in the urban or also the rural context, where people are reinventing how we are organizing mobility, food, energy, and the local economy. And I think these are some of the networks that we've worked with in our European projects. And I hope a lot of you recognize some of these networks from your own context. The interesting thing is that where historic transitions were all about technology and mass markets and standardization, what we see now is that this transformative innovation, it's a mix of new technologies and new practices. They are very localized, so they are very context specific. So in your city, you might have a transition town, or you might have some food initiative, a cooperative. They are small scale, but the interesting thing is that they start to create global movements. So we talk about the translocal character of these networks. There are now millions of people worldwide that are involved in these very small scale or localized initiatives. And what they do is they share the way that they organize it. They standardize contracts. They create narratives. They create sharing platforms for experience. And this in itself makes the urban and the local context the basis for radical change. And I need to go to the last few minutes of my presentation to point forward to what this means for governance. Because what we see now is a context that creates institutional uncertainty, but it also opens up a space where a lot of initiatives in communities with policymakers, businesses are reinventing the way we organize society. And the principles they do that on is with a systemic mindset. So not a disciplinary or a fragmented or a policy logic. No, it's a systemic mindset using this transitions idea, and then a backcasting logic. So not improving the existing, but taking justice and sustainability as a starting point for identifying what we want to do or don't do anymore. And the strategy to get there is selective participation. So not with everybody, but only start with the actors and the initiatives that are already on their way. So policy is not the start of it. No, the transition is happening, and policy should facilitate, support, and work with society. And that's there's a lot of instruments and strategies for it, but you can come to the expo to learn more about it. For example, we have a project on urban transition arenas, bringing together the communities on sustainability and justice to create a shared narrative. We work with governments to create transition agendas, as we call it. So this is a figure from the Rotterdam Climate Agreement, which is all about combining different strategies. Or it's about city labs. I think in a lot of cities there are these kind of experiments going on. These are all alternative instruments. Behind it, because these are all different instruments that you can use in your method box, but the overall context we refer to as a governance mix. And this is the main message I want to give to you at the end of my presentation. It's not only about embracing this idea of a just sustainable future, but it's about developing a strategic approach to help build up the sustainable. So what are the practices, the alternatives already emerging or present in your city, and how can you make them stronger but also institutionalize? How can you adapt the existing institutions, rules and regulations to support the new regimes that are emerging? And what can you do to anticipate and help phase out the undesired? This is my colleague Georgia. She will be at the expo. So we translate these governance approaches into workbooks, or work a lot with cities on sort of, this is about nature-based solutions, but the logic is really to create in your cities a reflexive context, we call it, so networks of these change makers, and use this governance mix or strategy as an umbrella, as a logic to really empower a community of change agents in the local communities, in the business, in a government, and in research, to reinvent with each other the city that you're living in. And these are my key messages summing it up. In general, I feel that the COVID momentum, it creates a very ambiguous context. So I see national governments in a way putting transitions on pause. So they're using a lot of money to keep the economy as it is alive, and unfortunately not having a transition plan. What you do see on the other hand is that a lot of cities are actually embracing these transformative changes and making quantum leaps forward on nature, on mobility transition, and so on. And I think seize this momentum, but also translate it into institutional changes to empower these alternative networks and support the transitions that we want and that are possible the coming decade. Thank you for your attention. Look forward to the questions if I still left time for it.